Hey, Vanessa, what's up?
It's cold. The Arctic freeze is upon us.
Luckily, today we have an episode about misery.
Just what you need to get the new year off right.
It's an important theme for me to convey in our podcasts that being openly miserable is fun. It should not be frowned upon, and
That the tendency of your Americans to smile at each other at all cost is
Infuriating.
morally reprehensible.
and truly that's why I wanted to have Helen Russell, an author, journalist, and happiness researcher, join us today to show and explain why
You're right.
I'm right.
Yes. She wrote a book, How to Be Sad, which basically makes the case that embracing sadness is not only good for you, but will enable you to be happy.
Sings the praise of being openly, publicly, and honestly sad.
We talk a lot about the fact that the extent to which we're allowed to express happiness or sadness is very culturally informed, and Americans have a particular bent towards hiding it.
So much so that it seems that even in the art world, Americans prefer the happy and the cheerful. And I refer listeners to our conversation with Dara Horn on this from last episode.
And we also kind of touch a little bit what it means on a societal level when you're encouraged to repress certain emotions and express other ones.
So, unfortunately, we had her only for, I think, 40 minutes.
Yeah, it was a short one. We had to keep it tight, which we're not known at being good for.
No. We like verbosity and
And we like unpacking things,
packing on certain things.
which is the podcast you're listening to right now, by the way.
Right, yes.
Uncertain
Welcome to Uncertain Things. So, having to keep it short, we raced through topics.
Yeah, it's kind of like a amuse-bouche platter of different topics of sadness.
But because this topic raised a lot of questions that we didn't get to bring up to Helen, Vanessa and I ended up continuing the conversation afterwards. And we explored issues like criminal justice and happiness, or the importance of being defiantly unhappy, something that I deeply believe in. And we've tacked on that extended conversation at the end of the interview. So if you're interested in more on the topic, stick around.
And feel free to send us your angry thoughts and disagreements.
No, your happy or sad thoughts.
That binary of happy.
Yeah, it can't be both.
Just a heads up, we are probably going to have Mark Leela for our next episode, which I'm deeply excited about. And after that, we're going to have an interesting, different conversation about neuroscience and deception through an interesting perspective. Very weird, interesting perspective, I think. So stuff to look forward to. And please follow us on uncertain.substack.com. If you have a chance, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, because that helps a hell of a lot. Really, seriously, it helps us a lot. So if you have a chance, please do that.
The days are short, the nights are long and cold. Please to provide us with the happiness of a 5-star Apple review.
And with that,
Helen Russell.
Hey, Helen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know our time is short, but how about you give us a quick elevator bio, at least so we know how you got into the this topic of happiness.
Okay, so my name is Helen Russell. I am a journalist and happiness researcher, and having spent the last 10 years researching into happiness worldwide, it became clear to me many people are phobic of feeling sad. And so I decided to turn my attention to finding out how we can get better at sadness and why we should bother trying.
I also feel like when people hear the word happiness researcher, they assume that you must be constantly peppy and just really obsessed with all things that bring forth joy. But you say, like in your book and in your TED Talk, that you have a long relationship with sadness. So would you mind describing how your biography kind of has informed the way you've started to research this field?
Yeah, of course. So it's been a kind of personal and professional quest, I guess. So when I was little, my sister died of sudden infant death syndrome. And at that time, in the 1980s, it just wasn't something that was talked about. It was still very much that idea of what you don't talk about can't hurt you. And I grew up, as many of us will have, with the idea that we should all be pursuing happiness at all costs. Just stop crying, dry your tears, get on with things. And so that's what I did. And a therapist later told me it was no surprise at all that I had decided to pursue happiness all of these years. But I've also, as you say, I've experienced depression. I've had depression on and off for the last 20 years. I've experienced infertility, IVF, we all have stuff. So my experiences won't be universal, but we all have stuff. And so I really wanted to look at why there wasn't space for that in the way we speak about our lives and our emotions. And we can't be happy all the time. So we may as well find a way to be sad better.
It's funny because I this is a obsession of mine, the learning how, not just learning how to be sad, but also learning to really, at least from my perspective, to really appreciate that capacity for sadness rather than walling it off. But what's interesting about the way you approach it in your book is how biographical it is. It's almost like a journaling of the different flavors of sadness that you've discovered, and not all types of sadness or melancholy are created equal in your book. So can you talk a little bit about how the different types of sadnesses that you encounter, not just from the personal biographical perspective, but of their types and how they manifest in society?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea of flavors, like it's a sort of ice cream.
Sad ice cream.
Sometimes they aren't your favorite. And I'm also very clear to distinguish between depression, which is, of course, a chronic mental illness that needs help, and sadness, on the other hand, which is this temporary emotion that we all feel when we have experienced loss or disappointment or something is wrong in our lives. So yeah, I was very interested in looking at things like shame, for example. So Jung called it the soul-eating emotion. And shame can be so detrimental and can be so painful. It's something that makes us see ourselves as defective or worthless. Interestingly, it does have a point. It's intended to defend us against that social devaluation. So from my experience, I experienced a lot of shame around infertility because I was not able to do something that society decrees I should have been able to do, have children. And also I had to spend a lot of time naked from the waist down with my legs in stirrups. Now, society tells us not to flash our genitals at strangers. I was having to do that. I was experiencing shame. It makes sense the way that comes into play, but it's not helpful. And although we all experience shame, there's a real gender difference in the way we experience it and the times we experience it. So for men, there's a lot of shame, historically, and of course, this is not for everybody, but overall studies have found around even expressing emotion. And that just felt so problematic. There is no equality unless we have equality of emotion. And for women, it can often be around things like being in the workplace or new parenthood, or, all of these times that actually we are going to need some extra support. And then I look at grief a lot as well. And I refer to grief not in terms of just death, but living losses too. And we've all experienced those from family estrangement or just, losing a relationship. So I think there's lots of these different touch points throughout our lives. And back when we could go around the world meeting people and hugging and talking, and those were the days, I would speak to people after events who had maybe just lost their home or just lost a loved one, and they would still ask, so why aren't I happy? And I would have to explain, sometimes we need to be sad. Sadness has a point. It is this really useful, actually, message that can tell us when something is wrong and what to do about it. But we do have to listen. And that's hard. We are often raised to eschew discomfort. There's this great study that showed that the first thing that most babies taste after milk is painkillers. From a really young age, we are told to avoid discomfort, to avoid pain. And in doing
that's a horrifying factoid,
isn't it? Yeah, startling. Yeah,
it's very, very Brave New World, isn't it? It's like start them on Soma from a young age.
Yes, yeah, and but I think that's a cultural thing as well, because Americans are outliers in the desire to avoid sadness, and the UK is not far behind. But you look at other cultures like Russia, for example, where sadness is okay, and it's also even celebrated. It's useful. Yeah. And so it's really interesting. And you look at East Asia as well, there's a very different approach. So what we perhaps think of as, in inverted commas, normal, we're a product of our culture. So I think that was worth unpicking as well.
So can you go a little deeper into that? Because I find those cultural differences fascinating and something that I ramble about in this podcast a lot. So can you get a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, the taboo is really interesting. Like, why is it so taboo in certain cultures?
Yeah, so in East Asian culture, studies show there is much more of an acceptance that sometimes we feel happy and sad. There's more of an acceptance of the granularity of emotion. You can have both of them at the same time. You're not lugging around that constant sense of unease or guilt around it. There is really interesting studies between Japan and the US, both wealthy nations, And psychologists in Japan have said it never occurred to us to try and medicate away things like melancholy because it never occurred to us that this was a problem. So we've all seen studies showing that, happier people are healthier. Well, actually, that's predominantly true in the US, where there is this phobia of being sad. Being sad only makes you sick if you're terrified of being sad. If you look at in Japan, for example, people who feel sad have the same blood lipid profiles, they have the same BMI, the same health indicators. It doesn't have an impact. And again, you look at cultures like Bhutan.
Let's just stick on Japan for a second, because it's actually interesting, because it goes to the point of the richness of what being sad means. On one hand, from my brief familiarity with Japanese culture, it definitely contains value in something that is, let's call it anti-happiness, or whatever it is that is not just ebullient and joyous. And there's an acceptance, an expectation that people must undergo it in life rather than try to constantly fight it off. But at the same time, there are a lot of other rigidities that go unaddressed in terms of filling your social role, filling your cultural expectations, filling your sexual expectations, and failing to live up to that can be devastating. And we might not call it healthy sadness, and it's certainly a sadness that is not easily dealt with culturally in Japan, and historically has led to a high rate of suicide. And so it shows that the taboo around your permissible emotions exists there as well, just maybe the framework is different.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and when I last went to Japan for work, I had lots of people pointing out, you'll have heard the term like karoshi, this sort of death by overwork. I had people pointing out, well, we lost a colleague here and we lost a colleague there. It's pretty normalized. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying that other countries don't have their own issues, but I think I spoke to Jeannie Tsai from Stanford, who has done a lot of research into comparing East Asian culture with America, and her theory is now that it's around pioneer values, that the early European settlers to the US, the advantage to them was escaping a situation that was not great, it was not comfortable, and moving forward and always looking forward. And so that sort of active pursuit of happiness, these sort of extroverted, outgoing approaches to life were valued and rewarded, which kind of makes sense.
But a couple of threads that you brought up, both of which I hopefully we'll touch on, but one of them you were talking about the kind of the gendered way that we allow people to regulate their emotions. And I'm just thinking, like, my partner got a lot of flack growing up for crying. His mom actually wanted him to cry whenever he wanted. She was a very open person when it came to emotions. But in his culture in West Virginia, it wasn't okay for him to cry. So he learned very quickly, one must not cry. And I would say me, on the flip side, I think I've gone through my life not being able to access anger because I think, it's not okay for me to be angry. It is okay for me to be sad. But then when you get into the workforce, it can be problematic sometimes because, crying after a meeting is not really socially acceptable. So I'm just curious, how these gender dynamics in terms of what emotions we're allowed to feel, how they have an impact, I guess, on a societal and cultural level.
So to be fair, I'll just say that I also found out the hard way that lashing out at your colleagues after a meeting is also not quite acceptable.
Right. Emotions have their place, I guess, and not at work.
Yeah, I'm nodding very hard throughout all of this, which is not great for a podcast, but you're absolutely right. I think there is something about boys and girls from a very young age are taught to take different emotions from the bookshelf of our emotional spectrum. And there's been research into this. Dr. Ad Vindhooks from the Netherlands has looked at how much we cry, and boys and girls are inclined to cry around the same amount. Then by the age of around 10, boys are getting to be discouraged from crying and encouraged to choose anger from the shelf instead, whereas girls are not encouraged to be angry, famously, and are encouraged to they actually found that women do tend to cry more than men, but it's not really because of any of the deep-seated biological things. It's because of our social conditioning. It's because usually it's out of a sense of frustration or powerlessness, because that anger is closed down to us as an option. So I think that is really problematic, because of course we all feel this. I didn't get in touch with my anger till I think late 20s on an airplane, which was not that helpful. But I think it's problematic.
What
as
happened?
you say. Oh my goodness. Well, I'd had a very bad breakup. I'd been on a press trip where things had gone a little bit wrong. And I realized I'd made a big professional mistake. And so I went into the loo on a plane back from Miami and did some neck pillow screaming. It's fine. But, and I'm not saying as well that we don't have to vent. I don't go for this hydraulic theory of emotion. When we are feeling that anger, is just as you say about we shouldn't be venting and shouting after a meeting and getting mad. We should, however, allow ourselves to experience these feelings, and we choose what we do with them. So it's not punching a wall. It's thinking, okay, I'm feeling this, and labeling it. And that's something that we can really help teach the next generation. I'm very passionate about that, of not dismissing kids' feelings and allowing them to have all of them.
Yeah, I mean, in your TED Talk, you talk about the haka as a good example of how to take emotion, channel it, and put it out in the world in a way that can be understood and, I guess, interacted with,
Yeah, and that was such a powerful thing. A haka teacher worked with me a little, and as a repressed British woman, this was incredibly hard. But I'd never, had been legitimately allowed to shout and become all of these emotions at the same time, and it was all allowed. And yeah, as you say, in haka there is less of a disconnect between showing all of your emotions and strength. They are considered the same thing, which is so far from many of our experiences that it just felt a really interesting thing to explore.
But this is really the most difficult thing, isn't it? The idea is that you want to make sure that you experience the sadness. You want to make sure that you experience the anger, that you go through those litany of feelings rather than suppress them.
Mm-hmm.
But
like
then
you
at the
said,
same
they're
time,
useful. They're useful.
Right, they're useful, but at the same time, they clearly do need to be suppressed to some extent. So it is always some sort of self-manipulation, self-restraint, some form of quelling of the river.
I'm not sure about that. I think of it now very much like a beach ball, that if you're going to push it down, it's going to pop up somewhere. That if we can allow ourselves to sit with our sadness, it is likely to pass on more easily. And there's studies now, going back decades, that trying to suppress so-called negative emotions doesn't work. It makes them come back with a vengeance. And the cost of not facing our emotions is far greater than the discomfort we may experience temporarily by feeling them. So I understand what you mean. In a meeting, you perhaps don't want to break down and cry, but to acknowledge, gosh, I'm actually really sad right now. And then you can even park that as something, okay, after this meeting, I'm going to go and think about that. So as long as you're giving that space for it, it can't be deferred forever.
It also kind of, I think, speaks to the necessity for art, I guess, in our world, which I feel like America is very, very bad at embracing or giving resources to arts and culture. But there is something about having transforming emotion into something creative, and that's, I feel like, potentially the most socially acceptable way of transforming the emotions that you feel and putting it into something more, I guess, like the haka, like something that people can interact with, talk to, and have some sort of sense of connection with.
Yeah, I get producing art certainly so beneficial for mind, body, and spirit, but there's also so many benefits we know now from bearing witness to art, from reading, from going to the theatre, from experiencing that, putting yourself into someone else's shoes, the ultimate act of empathy. And in Scandinavia and in the Australia now, there are lots of, they call them culture vitamin programs, where doctors will prescribe arts on prescription. And it's been shown to be incredibly cost effective, actually. Over a 5-year period, you see that people feel better, people on long-term sick leave, or people with depression, or people just really feeling out of sorts, that people do start feeling a lot better if they are encouraged into culture a little more. And, we've all experienced it. It's one of the first things to fall by the wayside when you are feeling low. It seems like a luxury, but it's really not.
Can you go a little deeper into that? Because I can also see, where the line of art is drawn might be the key, but sometimes you're depressed and then you're binging a Netflix series. I don't know how emotionally nourishing that is.
Yeah, I'm not talking Succession, although, because I always end up feeling quite worse after that about the world. But it's not necessarily Netflix. It's things where there is often maybe a polyphonic voice, so a novel where you are putting yourself into someone else's shoes and you're thinking about someone else's point of view. It's quite you're stretching your mind. You're creating new neural pathways. Listening to music has been shown to reduce stress. There's a great study that showed that mice who were played Verdi's La Traviata during recovery from a heart transplant we don't know why they were having a heart transplant, but they recovered 4 times. They lived, 4 times longer than those who were denied their fill of opera. There are lots of studies to show that getting involved with a story can increase oxytocin, the hormone of care and connection. Getting scared or watching sad stories can give us sort of an idea of adrenaline and endorphins as our body gets ready to fight that off as we imagine it in real life. And there's also stuff about great art and design. In Denmark, where I live now, it's been known as a design society since the 1920s, when there were big social challenges, but the government at the time decided that design should be a priority, that it was important for health and happiness. And so they invested in art schools, in design, in public sculpture. And actually, it's been proven that it is really helpful. Studies from London have shown that it creates dopamine in our brain. It has the same brain activity as being in love. So all of these things that seem like nice to haves, actually, there's a lot of studies out there to show that they are making a big difference.
Oh yeah, no, Vanessa knows my obsession with especially street level art and design. And one of my recurring rants about how awful New York City is the fact that every street has basically transformed into a carbon copy of any other street, including the same set of the exact same 5 to 6 chain stores, making you feel like you're not out in the real world, but walking through a mall. And my commitment is to the idea that this is not just ugly and depressing and doesn't offer you, consumer options. It's also actually emotionally burdensome when you walk out and you see the same picture over and over again, and it feels cold, and none of that gives you even a signal of human interaction and of village life. Your interaction with the outdoors becomes more oppressive. Go anywhere else, to any city or town that has some sort of street vibrancy, and I'm not even talking about street art, just seeing a diversity of businesses, of people, a street that communicates liveliness, that broadcasts, come here, people will engage with you. There is color, there is variety. Automatically, your day becomes brighter. Even when you're in a bad state or emotionally melancholy, you'll find more support in your surroundings to cope with that state.
Yeah, the sensory deprivation of row after row of the same stores, or these chain experiences. Yeah, it is a problem, isn't it? And I think I'm also quite interested in the flip side of that, where you are getting that stimulation all the time. Like often when we go on vacation, we perhaps snack less, or we check our phone less, because there's just stuff going on. We are being fed in different ways. I always like the example of Florence syndrome. You may have come across the guy who discovered it, was looking around the art and the amazing art in Florence, and just kept feeling like he was going to fall to the ground. Just the sheer overwhelming emotion of it all. I think I have looked at paintings that have made me kind of catch my breath, and there's something really powerful about that.
Yeah, and it's something also when you were talking about art that I didn't realize, but I think you have the stat in your book. It's that you say that it kind of stimulates a part of your brain that is the part that is about connection. And I guess I hadn't really considered that, the fact that the way we experience art is kind of like a sibling or a child, I guess, of the way we experience social interaction. And it's interesting because I think everybody knows that social interaction is good for us. Like, I think most people have the general understanding that we need friends to be happy, but at the same time, I feel like we've gone to great lengths to avoid people as much as possible. And my background is urban planning, and I think I can see it even like in my professional background is in urban planning, and I can see it in the cityscape. Like we are isolating ourselves more. We're not interacting in America anyway, in like plazas and public spaces as much. And I also think about in America, just like the family unit has become the central unit where you're supposed to derive all happiness and fulfillment at the deprivation of having a larger network. So I'm just curious about how you think about this paradox where, like, while we know we need people and friends, it seems like we're creating a whole culture and society that purposely prevents us from developing friendships.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's not just the US, it's all over. Yeah, the idea that you can avoid your neighbors in the way you move about your space these days. And, we can do so much stuff online, which has been a help in some ways during the pandemic, but in other ways we've been less connected. I spoke to Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist from Oxford, who has Dunbar's number, the main people that we need 5 close friends that we see every week. And during the pandemic, we haven't been able to do that for many of us. And, we are losing a lot of the connections that we know will help us through things. And I looked at things like social anxiety and even telephobia, that fear of using the phone that many elder millennials or Gen Xers, as I am cusping, that we have, this idea of, why is somebody calling me? What is wrong with them? Why are they not sending a message? It's a really tricky one. But again, it's I think getting used to that discomfort. It's sitting with that awkwardness of, I'm going to have an actual phone conversation. And therapists recommend exposure therapy and just trying it and going a bit longer each time. But it's hard. I think it is a lot harder to make. You have to make the conscious effort to maintain those connections these days in a way, as you say, we would never have done historically, nor were we meant to.
I think it's a proof of how atrophied that sense of small, tight-knit community is in the US, that when you hear the word community used in a public context, it's usually in a commercial, go to this cafe, it has a great community, or this luxury apartment building offers its own local community, you cringe because whatever that word denotes is not what you really need. It's not this type of nourishing connections that you're actually looking for. There even the word friendship, sometimes when I hear it used in an American context, seems to be, don't think that means what you think it means. It makes me think of Roman history where the word friendship was a utilitarian concept. When you were talking about your amici, you were talking about your clients or your political clout, rather than the people that your mental well-being depends on.
Yeah, so and almost as though it's all being commodified quite a lot. I'm from the UK where we have a similar situation, but I'm in Denmark right now, and there is this, throughout Corona, there's been this term samfundssyn, from samfund meaning community and syn meaning mind, and it's being used more and more. And there is a sense, it's very hard to separate the personal from the political. And I was raised in Margaret Thatcher's Britain, but increasingly, the more time I spend in egalitarian Scandinavia, I start to see the point of it all, because here the idea is that everybody pays their taxes and they're looked after. So you do inevitably feel a sense of community. Danes are very into privacy, but there is an inherent sense of community because you are paying for your neighbor's kid to go to school. There is more and more work needed to get to that place in the US and the UK.
It's actually a great point. About the Danish concept, and this is something I grew up in Israel, and I also share that. I come across, I think, for a lot of our audience in the podcast as much more on the libertarian side compared to many of the people that we speak to. But this is the point where I actually not, if to the extent that I do believe in socialism or socialist underpinnings, is exactly that. It's less about economic policy, but as a means to ensure mutual dependency or mutual responsibility. It's the closest to an actual social contract where everyone agrees we are each other's guarantors. It has an enormous power knowing that your neighbors are not going to let you fall into the abyss. You're not going to fall off the grid. The entire community guarantees a base level of security. And if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to the pyramid of needs in terms of well-being, it's exactly on that level of the level of baseline security, of being able to plan ahead for 2 and 3 days without worrying about existential threats, where financial, pecuniary concerns really do matter. Beyond that, it's about community, about connections. And that's why it's doubly powerful when the community itself is the source of your economic security and strength. Because without it, you're in a total scarcity mindset, and thinking about building connections is a privilege.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I always say it's much easier to live the American dream in Denmark than it is in the US, because you have your basic needs taken care of, so you can, reach the top. You can be a libertarianism because you know that you have that freedom to do that. But I think, there's so much research now about the link between inequality and stress, and inequality and addiction. Even it's very clear to me that the idea of sort of big society and politics cannot be separated from many of the things that I've been working on and talking about around happiness and sadness over the last few years.
Can you go a little into that?
Yeah, so I think that there's been lots of research that shows that, for example, if you are living in a neighborhood where perhaps you have a really nice house, but down the street people don't have so much money, there's that anxiety. And if you're living in a house that isn't so great and your neighbor has 12 Ferraris, you're gonna feel resentful. You're gonna perhaps feel quite stressed. You're gonna look at what you have and have that comparison anxiety. And addiction, is often described as the opposite of connection. But it's this idea of you want to numb that. That feels uncomfortable, especially in the media climate that we are raised into. We have our self-image taken away from us and sold back to us for the price of a product. So it's very easy to see why you would opt for something, whatever your crutch may be, whatever your addiction may be from food to online shopping, to alcohol, to cigarettes, to gambling, to just have something to numb that sense of discontent. And there's a real link there. It's the same with addiction. There's a real strong link to that and unresolved grief. Because if you are pushing down that bouncy ball forever and you're trying to find ways to not think about that uncomfortable feeling, you're going to want to numb out. You're going to want to try and find other ways to not feel that pain. And I say that as someone who has tried all of the ways. So yeah, it's when you see it in black and white, it's quite startling.
I think that's now that I think about it, the addiction element, I think, is part of the reason that the question of art has become troubled a little bit today, because I don't think that Succession that you brought up is necessarily a bad vehicle for putting yourself in other people's shoes.
You don't want to be like them.
I definitely don't want to be like them, but I think there is a lot to learn when you're thinking about the way that power can interfere with your ability to communicate with your fellow humans. But never mind that. My point is that the big problem with entertainment is addiction. Addiction is a way to avoid actually dealing with the underlying emotions. And binging is a form of addiction, a form of numbing, no matter what you binge. But crucially, a lot of the entertainment consumption today is through social media. So the thing that you're binging is you're getting your art quotient in Instagram posts and TikTok, sometimes at the expense of going out and experiencing things more directly. So whatever the quality in consuming art is to well-being, I think it's diminished probably when it's consumed through this addictive behavior, this compulsion to go on social media and get the next fix.
Right. Yes. And I guess our smartphones are probably the thing that unite us all in terms of acceptable in inverted commas addiction. Yeah. I think and that is a real problem. I got a bit obsessed with the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who is the ultimate gloom king. But I spoke to a Kierkegaard professor and I sort of asked, what do you think he'd make of social media these days? He said, he think it's absolutely terrible. This idea that traditionally we would have compared ourselves to, say, the 30 people around us, and now we are comparing ourselves to the top 1% in the world. And of course we don't look like them or have as much money as them or have these skills that they have. Yeah, it's really problematic. I think as context, I used to live and work as a journalist in London for 12 years, and I thought I was doing all of the things to tick the boxes to be, so-called happy in my life. And I was exercising, and I was eating things with green juice involved, and I was doing exercise classes with things like pump in them. But I was also on my phone and my BlackBerry, which dates me, a lot of the time. And the idea that we can ever kind of truly get our stuff together and get even without addressing the social media and the technology side is a bit of a pipe dream, really. So yeah, I think if we try to block out a spectrum of our emotions or dissociate from them by going to social media, that's not going to help us either.
And I wonder if there is even a path in which we live with social media without it causing this numbness, or is it just inherent to the product? Is that a device that is just inherently puts you in a dissociative state?
I guess there's very smart people who are designing it to
do just that,
make us addicted. Yeah. So I think we have to really limit our connection with it. I'm now a big believer of going on airplane mode as much as possible, and just trying to make sure that I have all those set timers. And you've been on Instagram for 30 minutes today, and then it's time to stop.
I'll actually take this opportunity to debut my solution to social media, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, share.
Just because it's something that we've been debating a lot on the podcast, talking to experts from journalism to history and technology. And I've often expressed my discomfort with regulatory solutions to this problem. However, recently I logged out of Facebook on my phone. And when I came back, I was asked for my password. And then I had to stop and ask myself, do I actually need to go in? Am I really interested in what's behind that wall? And the answer was no. And no, it has remained for a couple of months now. The funny thing is that I still find myself going into Facebook on muscle memory, but every time this prompt asking for the password stops me from actually going in. And then I didn't actually intend to go to Facebook, so fuck that. So our friend Ken, who I've told about this, said, well, this should be the new regulation. It's a very minor and unintrusive rule, but you should just never have auto login. If you don't have auto login, you actually need to choose to go into the product, whether they then go in on sheer addiction. And that might be the simplest way to reduce the use of these platforms as an immediate sedative.
You're right, and absolutely muscle memory, the extension of your arm in some cases. But isn't that mad that we have to habit stack to stop us doing something that our grandparents would have not have computed?
Right, but that's the nature of the and beauty of
The
addiction.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's like something about it, I guess it kind of feigns connection. There's something about feigns connection in, I guess, a low stakes way. And
Right.
that's part of what like we get addicted to. It's like, oh, I'm messaging with people. Oh, I'm interacting with people. But then at the same time, there's like this profound like dissatisfaction after like 25 minutes of just like, I've done nothing. There was no real connection. And at the same time, it's taking the place of what would have been
Right.
walking somewhere, having a conversation, having an uncomfortable moment, like, and which at the end of the 25 minutes would feel much more satisfying, probably at the end.
It goes to the perversion of those words, friend and community. Like you have the community on Twitter, you have your friends on Facebook. Those aren't what those words mean.
But I mean, but I was curious though, Helen, in your research, I mean, because I've been very curious about like co-housing models. And like I've done a little bit of research into them. And they seem very appealing to me, especially for people who are parents, because there seems to be like, it seems to be a model where you live in community, whatever that means. You live in community with people, and there is a kind of orientation towards childcare and support in a way that seems, at least from the outside, not having lived in a co-housing complex, that seems to be like a very healthy way of living. And I'm curious if you've done any research into that and how that has, if it's true, if it seems to be like a better way for humans to live.
I think absolutely, yeah, it is. Yeah, I think that there's no way we're supposed to be raising our children in nuclear families the way we are now. And actually, Denmark has a big tradition of this communal housing in this way. And my lovely neighbours, left to join a communal housing centre, and they have 3 kids, and yeah, they only have to cook dinner once a week, and there are people there all the time. And of course, there'll be people you don't get on with, but there's often people in your own family you don't get on with. So yeah, it seems a nice way to be. And I think, looking at the family unit and how we raise our children, it used to be that if you don't love yourself, then how can you love someone else? But actually, now psychologists are starting to see that if you have not been loved, if you have not had that model to you, that's when you're going to face problems growing up. So the more different examples of ways to live, the more love that you're getting as a child, the more you're being allowed to have these emotions and sort of really experience things in a low stakes environment, like a safe, big, extended family, the better you're going to do, the more resilient you're going to be as you move forward.
The theme of raising a child and your journey with that runs through your book. How much did your relationship with your own sadness or sadness in general affect your thinking about having a child? Or did you worry that it will come into play?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I am very conscious of, I'm going to make new mistakes. I'm hopefully not going to make the same mistakes. And everyone who helped raise me did the best that they could with the tools available to them and the background that they had come through, the silent generation, the people who didn't talk about things, who'd been raised by people who'd been in a war. But I'm very conscious of, for example, when I am now fortunate enough, I have children. And so if a child falls over, I don't say, don't cry, or, it's okay. Or if someone says, oh, I'm scared of the dark, I don't say there's nothing to be afraid of, because then that's denying that emotion. And children grow up feeling ashamed, like, well, maybe I was wrong, grow up distrusting their emotions. So now from my research and speaking to the best psychologists and the best minds in the business on this, the memo I've got and that I try to put into play is trying to sort of validate that and help label those feelings, but also help them to work out what's appropriate, helping with emotional regulation, something many of us didn't get as children, so have to teach ourselves as adults, which is far harder. But trying to sort of say to them, well, you just lost your troll. Maybe that's like a 6. Maybe that's not an 11 right now, but I can see you're very upset, you're very frustrated. Let's sit with that. And you can't also reason with a child when they're really sad. You have to treat the emotion before you try and do any sort of logic in there. So that's something I try to do now. We just had Halloween, which is the anniversary of my sister's death. And so it's always a weird one for me. I was never celebrating it growing up. And now I kind of say to my kids, I love that you love dressing up. It's a bit of a sad day for grandma because she lost her daughter that day. But you can have that duality. You can have a happy day where you dress up as Elsa Zombie, and you can also remember your aunt who you never met. And it's complicated, but if we're teaching kids with minds like sponges then they're going to be okay. They're going to handle it.
I am curious though. You mentioned that you went through IVF, which it sounded like a pretty tricky and difficult time for you. And we've been having a lot of conversations about the decision to have kids, and because I think we are of an age, and I guess I am of an age where one has to start making these decisions. And there's like you said, there's a lot of societal pressures, particularly on women, to go forward on that path. I also think there's for a lot of people, there's a feeling that like, if I have a kid, I'm going to be happy because I'm going to be fulfilled and I'm going to have meaning. And so I'm just curious if you would take us back to when you were deciding that you wanted to have kids. Like, how were you weighing like why to have children, and if that would impact your own ability to be happy,
I would say that for me personally, it was more of an overwhelming compulsion that took over every atom of my body from the age of about 20, 25. So for me, though, it was I was almost possessed with this idea that I just wanted children so much, and it was very difficult for me to contemplate that might never happen, and there was a very good chance it might never happen. But I think there is certainly something about the idea of expecting children to bring you happiness, and that, of course, is problematic. We can't instrumentalize another human being in that way, and there's actually also some great research from Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who was at Harvard, who came up with the concept of arrival fallacy, and that was often around goals that we pursue, and when we get them, we feel a sense of anticlimax. And I spoke to lots of athletes and mountaineers and business people who'd achieved great things and then felt kind of flat, like a guy who'd been to the South Pole and said, oh, it looks a bit shoddy actually. But, actually I spoke to Tal Ben-Shahar and asked, am I going mad, or could you actually apply arrival fallacy to a long-term relationship or becoming a parent? And he said, yeah, absolutely. And especially now because of the media circus around parenting, because of the way it's portrayed in Hollywood movies, because of the marketing around parenting, our expectations are sky high and so unrealistic. And of course, even I wanted children more than anything I'd ever wanted in my life, but still there were days when I was woozy with the smell of excrement, hadn't slept for 48 hours, hallucinating colours. It's hard. It's still hard. And I believe very passionately that even though you have wanted something, you still get to moan about it some days. Right. You still get to have tough days. And yes, it's not going to solve any of your problems.
Right. I mean, we had an interesting conversation with Paul Bloom a few months ago around this idea of suffering being kind of one of the, how would you describe it? Like, I guess useful, and the thing that is most likely to create meaning in your life.
No, I think even went beyond that. I think suffering is a source for happiness, or at least a source of well-being.
Mm-hmm. And he used the example of having kids. It's like, you're never going to suffer more when you're raising children. And yet, at the end of the day, you're going to probably feel very, very fulfilled that you went through that.
I'm actually glad that you brought the arrival fallacy chapter. I thought it was one of my favorite chapters in the book. But also it brings up the question of, when we're talking about the difficulty of dealing with sadness and being open about this, sometimes it's not just about being open with the emotion, because sometimes it's the difficulty of admitting what is the source of the emotion. Sometimes it's about the discomfort of putting to words what exactly is it that you're going through. Contending with thoughts like, maybe I'm going through an anticlimax or an emotional breakdown because of having a child, that's a difficult thought to actually continence. And it requires a lot of emotional bandwidth to be able to actually think about it and deal with it. I wonder how much this difficulty, as a matter of social efficiency, comes into play in what you were saying about the pilgrims. Because when you have a society that is strapped for resources and is in deep scarcity, high mortality rates, dangers all around, and with needs to expand and explore, you can't really afford, the energy and complexity tax of having difficult dialogues with people. You need to make sure that you get along, make sure that you have enough shared language that you can communicate and coordinate without eating each other's heads off. So developing social norms based on constricting open interactions has a sort of efficiency to it, but comes at the cost of developing taboos. So how much do you think that's related to our difficulty with embracing and facing sadness directly? These social efficiencies that require us to not deal with certain questions.
I think that's really interesting. I think there's certainly something around taboos and having the difficult conversation with yourself. And that's uncomfortable as heck, but you have to do it. But, putting your historian's hat on, forget the pioneers for a moment. If you look at the Victorians, the death rate, the infant mortality was extraordinary around that time. But Victorians, what they did have were lots of rituals to help cope with death. And that helps. So studies found that rituals of any kind, doesn't really matter even if they're conflicting, they help you through the process of grief, they help you to feel better. So I don't think that the proliferation of death necessarily means that you have to dismiss it and move on. But of course, that's what we saw in, for example, the Second World War, or London's cholera outbreaks. But the Victorians specifically, I'm thinking, they still had a lot of death, but they still found ways to mark that loss, to be sad about it. They had the words to speak about it. They had the mourning dress and ways to work through it. I spoke to lots of people in the course of research for the book who had lost somebody, and many of them ended up making that reference to wishing there was still some sort of, these days, visible sign of grief, like a black armband or a pin of some kind that you could wear just to say, I am grieving right now. Just
you're communicating it. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. Although I do want to emphasize, I think the issue with the pioneers is less about dealing with grief itself, is being able to coordinate beyond grief. You need to make sure that you are preserving social cohesion or stability, because the society itself is so tenuous. Victorians had a very established society, so for them, the trouble was, how do I communicate my individual emotions properly within this established society? When your society is not established, you need to basically walk on eggshells, because every small piece that falls apart and everything collapses, everything implodes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if I have a direct sort of reference for that. I think the only thing I would say is that in working with now families who have lost a child and looking at our nuclear family today, there is something about, even whatever your situation, if you have care and responsibilities in any direction, even if you have a pet, you have to get up each day, you have to feed something that you're caring about, you have to go out of the house. So there is always something that forces you to get going. If you have something else, and that's another major, the point that I found that was really helpful for getting to be sad well, was having something else to care about beyond yourself. And that's really helpful.
I'm curious because, I mean, we could, on an individual level, there's like this, like you were talking about the bouncy ball, there is this theory, right, that if you don't process or deal with issues, including sadness, at some point it will catch up with you later, right? Like that's the idea, and I can see that on an individual level. Though I guess we could debate it, but I'm curious if on a societal level, if you've seen a culture or a society at some time period where that catching up thing happened, and where and when that might be, and what does that look like?
Oh,
societal pathologies.
Yeah, I may well get cast out of the United Kingdom forevermore, but I think there's something around that. If you look at, say, Brexit, where I'm from in the UK, this idea that for years the boomer generation were prioritizing the ego. There was this real emphasis, as in the US, on feelings, but they were meant to be the good feelings, really, and you were meant to sort of just keep calm and carry on, and just keep going and try and be cheerful. And but those sort of, I guess societal tensions were still there. And then you see in something like Brexit or the rise of Trump in the US or the rise of nationalism around the world, these feelings are there. And if we are not able to have these difficult conversations about class, about money, about race, about immigration, all of these conversations that need to be had, if there are a strata of society who are just smiling and saying everything's fine, nothing to see here, then we're in trouble because we can't have open and honest dialogue and try and make things better for everyone.
There's a part I really like in your book where you talk about the cognitive dissonance that people experience in American society, especially, where they find themselves misaligned with society's expectations or their projected roles in society, whether because they can't or won't live up to what they expect of themselves and think society expects of them. And the worst part is, as you point out, that these very people often lack the vocabulary to talk about this gap, this discrepancy, because they have grown up their entire lives absorbing these expectations. And the result is often a form of alienation and resentment. Emotions that, in lieu of the vocabulary to deal with this pain directly, can often lead people to search ways to vent and even destroy the society that they feel hurts them. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that a lot of the political movements that are driven by populist anger and rage of the past several years are, at least in part, the result of an inability to navigate this cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. I think as well it's worth pointing out that there are some, it's not just that not talking about sad things is bad for you, but that actually talking about sad things and allowing for temporary sadness, there are some really positive things as well. There's been some great research from the University of New South Wales showing that allowing for temporary sadness can help improve our attention to detail. It increases perseverance. It makes us more generous, more grateful for what we've got. A little like the old Stoic idea of imagine losing everything and you'll be grateful for what you have. But it also helps us to be more clear-eyed, which I find fascinating, that we are less susceptible to fall for the halo effect where we think the usually beautiful and rich can do no wrong, and less likely to fall prey to the fundamental attribution error where we become defensive and think people are out to get us. And in these kind of polarized media times, that feels hugely useful.
Right.
If we were maybe able to be a little bit more clear-eyed, I feel that would clear up, a good 50% of the tabloid news.
This is a point that I will explore this at a different time, but I think this is a measure of mine to often sift journalists that I appreciate more than others. And I think the journalists that I like to often tend to have this streak of melancholy, and I don't mean necessarily, I'm sure all of them have some melancholies in their personal lives, but a melancholy in their writing which shows that they write from a place of genuine, it's not cynicism, it's just an underpinning existential sadness. And this actually matters, like you pointed out, because when people have the rose-tinted glasses, tend to turn cynical very quickly, which actually, in a way, blinds them to complexities. Whereas people who are motivated by this underlying melancholy often see things a little more astutely, or at least more honestly, which gives them a better vantage point to describing and writing about the fallenness of our world, which ironically makes them less cynical and maybe even more hopeful.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's that balance between not avoiding the sadness and not avoiding the difficult conversations whilst also maintaining hope. And we have to have hope to make things better. Otherwise, what's the point? So, and I think that's another place where, for example, things like warm glow giving, or this idea that fundamentally, if we saw a child drowning in a pond, we would save them. Human beings are good fundamentally. So trying to kind of nourish that part and kind of kindle that flame feels really important.
Thank you, Helen, for joining us at such an early hour.
Oh, thank you. It's really lovely to talk to you. A really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media. If you have a minute, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because this helps a ton. Share us with your friends and enemies, and until next time, stay sane. There has been a great movement around the world to incorporate
parameters of well-being into the indices that judge a country's success. For instance, people have been, there's the famous happiness index, but in other ways as well, the idea that maybe the success of a country should not be primarily measured by things like GDP, but more about the general happiness of the population. I find it interesting because it always reeked to me of Brave New Worldism, because what is happiness? Who is happiness? How do you measure it precisely? And obviously, there's a great debate about it, but it's certainly an interesting piece of cultural shift, I think, around the world that is slowly occurring. But I wanted to raise two issues that I didn't get to talk to Helen, so I'm going to ask you instead. I wonder what you think about this. So one thing is, and this is more about the happiness side than sadness, it's a question of if we're starting to really take happiness as a metric for social thriving, should we also be applying that to things like justice? Do you think that there is room for using happiness as a measurement for how to apply justice? Because when you think about what it is that justice serves in a society, it's a correction for a wrong that was done. Usually we measure this wrong by, I lost a certain amount of money, or I lost certain abilities because harm was inflicted upon me, and now I want to either retrieve some of what I lost, or to punish the person so that I get some emotional satisfaction. See our conversation with Tamler Summers on the reasons why we punish people. But what if we use happiness as a metric for that? And that's a study that I remember reading, I think almost 10 years ago. And you start measuring your loss in terms of happiness loss. A crime has had a happiness cost on you. You've lost a certain amount of happiness. And similarly, when you punish people, maybe there should be some proportionality to the happiness that you take from them. So things like prisons, whether or not you're in prisons for 2 years and 10 years, could have almost identical happiness cost in some ways, because by being in prison, you tend to lose your ties to the community. You tend to lose the things that keep you mentally healthy. And that's why recidivism is so common, because those fundamental structures of social cohesion that are necessary for happiness, as Helen brings up, are destroyed the moment you go to prison, regardless of the time you serve. So maybe prison in itself is not a proportional punishment to the harm. If, when you give punishment to people who committed murder, as well as to people who have stolen a purse.
Oof. I mean, it's a big question. There's something about the word happiness that feels too imprecise and subjective to be the metric that I would want people to lean on when thinking about justice. Because I do think we have to reconceptualize the way we measure justice and outcomes. And I'm not sure that happiness is the right thing to peg it on. So for example, if I'm thinking about what would I want in an ideal world, a justice system to allow for, I would want people to have more access to opportunity, to like bouncing back, I guess resiliency. I don't really like that word, but that's the word that I think encapsulates that concept best. And I think actually economic, the capacity for social mobility via economic means are the things that I actually think I would put more emphasis.
You mean in terms of rehabilitation?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking beyond prisons as well. I'm thinking of like economic development, and we're thinking about
so preventative
neighborhoods and communities that are more likely to be members of communities where they're more likely to be sent to prison. I'm thinking of it kind of beyond just prison, right? There's like larger issues at play. And I'm not sure if happiness is the right metric to say, like, are we being successful in these communities? That might be one aspect of it, but I would probably make it like a tertiary one. And I think the first and second would probably be like, to what extent do folks in this community have the ability to generate wealth in their community, to move up the social ladder, to invest in their neighborhoods, to have the agency to create the institutions that they would need to support their neighborhoods. And I would almost imagine that if those things are sorted out, happiness will come along the way. But I don't know if you put happiness first, maybe that would work, but it just doesn't. I'm not sure if you're going to get the outcomes you're seeking to achieve.
I mean, that opens up the whole point about, we know that wealth building in itself is not sufficient for creating healthy communities. And going back to the unrest that the U.S. is experiencing broadly, there has been some decline or regression from the height of social mobility across the U.S., but the U.S. is still in a pretty great place economically, largely speaking, or on average. The problem is that the way that we experience that wealth is askew.
Mm-hmm.
It is not generating the same sense of fulfillment as maybe it used to. So the problem here is not only economic. There is an economic problem, and that there's inequality really is affecting people in a terrible way. And you don't need me to rile about American healthcare and the other corrupt systems that is keeping this inequality from closing, but that's not all that's going on.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with that, but I also think there's like kind of like a hierarchy of needs. I don't think people can be happy if resources are scarce and you're thinking about survival first, right? Like, I feel like you've got to get survival off the table first,
for sure,
and not just survival for like the day to day, but also like, will the generations that come after you be better off than you were?
Right. I think I bring up in the conversation with Helen, the minimum is to be able to look ahead and to feel like you have a tomorrow and you don't need to worry from hour to hour.
Mm-hmm.
Scarcity mindset brings everything down, and happiness is just irrelevant in that category.
Right.
But I assume that we're talking past that. We're talking about, the concept of justice to a world.
I mean, I don't know. The vast majority of people that are in jail come from cultures and communities where they're not past that. And if you're talking about justice, I don't know if you can.
It's a fair point.
Tackle that without the other.
Yeah. It's just a thought experiment, really.
Yeah.
It's not like we even have a clear enough, as I started by saying, we don't have a clear enough metric to even measure what we mean by happiness. But I like that thought experiment of what if we start plugging in happiness as at least one metric that we use to evaluate whether or not we're doing justice right.
And you did bring up the happiness index, which is what Bhutan uses. And I think we actually cut her off as she was about to get into Bhutan because we wanted to talk about so many different other things. But that is an example that I don't know that much about, that I'm sure we have some listeners who could tell us, that I don't know what that has meant on the real, like, day-to-day life. When your government is prioritizing happiness, what does that mean from a real, like, policy perspective? What gets funded, what doesn't? And I'm happy to look at that data. And if someone says, like, look, when you use this as a metric, actually all other outcomes, including economic outcomes, are improved, then I'm open to being convinced there.
Right. So Bhutan is a small East Asian country that has just adopted that as alongside the GDP as their metric for growth. And
I, like I said at the very beginning, I don't think that GDP is the end all be all framework. I actually think it's incentivized us in negative ways more than necessarily positive ways. And like I said, I think new frameworks are needed, not just for things like economic growth and justice, but I'm not yet sold that happiness is the lens through which we should judge how well society is doing.
Yeah. And I'll say it again. There is something always Brave New Worldy about it.
And to Helen's point, like, if happiness is the metric, then what happens to sadness?
Right. And that just brings me to the other point. I think I'm going to tack it at the end. Is like, if you feel like this was a short episode, we have a bonus conversation, ruminations, and brings me to my next point, which is back to sadness. This is not on the social level. This is, again, I guess it's semi-social. Something that was really important for me to ask Helen, and so I obviously forgot, was she emphasizes the importance of being sad. This is great. Interestingly, though, she comes at it from the perspective of, and she's British, right? Originally, she lives in Denmark, but she is originally from England.
Yeah, she wrote a best-selling book called The Year of Living Danishly.
Her perspective on sadness is from a place of, I had to discover how not to repress my despondencies. As somebody who's always been defiantly sad in public, whenever somebody would ask me from, I think, elementary school, hey, how are you? I would say horrible, because I hated that question. From my perspective, I always had the other challenge of, sure, people want to be there for you, but to what extent and what are the limits? There is a point in every society, even societies that are more open to people being honest about their feelings, where your miserableness becomes a burden.
Yeah.
And how do you navigate that? No matter how much we preach it, nobody's going to tolerate you being sad all the time.
I mean, I guess I would ask you two follow-up questions then. To what extent has being defiantly sad helped or harmed you in your personal or professional life? And then part two of my question is, do you feel the opposite taboo? Do you feel a taboo around showing too much happiness? Is that like anti your identity?
But I wouldn't call it taboo if it's on a personal level. I find it just unseemly to be happy.
That could be some sort of, you think it's purely, I mean, you're Mr. Everything is Culture. It can't be purely individual, right?
I mean, no, yeah, but it was in defiance to Israeli culture as well, because Israeli culture was also have like, hey, let's go party. I don't find being happy unseemly, really. I find feigned happiness unseemly. You know, we talked about this sometimes with people hugging each other. I like hugs, but I don't like people feeling obligated to hug each other. I want to hug a person when I feel like hugging them. And similarly with expressing joy or excitement and all those emotions that are wonderful.
But I want to hear about them only when they're real. First thing in the morning, somebody asks you, how are you? And you say,
oh, I'm doing great. You're not doing great.
it's 7 in the morning. Nobody's doing great. It's a lie. Stop it.
And obviously it gets worse with that, but when you're talking to people who are clearly experiencing some degree of anxiety or not even necessarily depression, but just complicated emotions that are the result of their personal life, professional life, instead of expressing them, they know that they need to project an air of confidence and put togetherness. And I just find that really, really ugly. It's aesthetically unpleasing to me. So it's against that I am defiant. So I just pick that my default is misery, and I live in that comfort misery. So I don't think it's a taboo so much as an aesthetic preference. Professionally, surely this has not been looked upon fondly, but I think.
But you're also working in America, so.
Right? No, but the places where I end up working are usually places that kind of accept that. With friends, though, I think it actually is valuable because in a way it was used as a sifting mechanic. If you find my bluntness on this uncomely, then fair enough. We were probably not meant to be friends. You survived it despite your American upbringing. So what does that tell us? You have a big heart.
No, I don't. I don't think it's that. I think it. I don't know why it didn't off-put me. It might be some because I am inclined to repression like Helen with my pseudo British upbringing, so there might be like a bit of like admiration or jealousy around being around people who can be so openly grumpy. Like that's some I think when I was growing up I was inclined not to show sadness. I was very much as like only be happy. I think as I got older I started feeling and accepting sadness more, but I still haven't accessed anger. That feels like an emotion that I still don't feel like I'm allowed to.
Oh, interesting.
To feel, let alone like to feel even privately, let alone publicly. So I feel like there's a lot of layers to go with
that's interesting.
Emotional experience.
Why do you think that anger is more taboo for you?
I mean, and we talked about this with Helen, but I think it's a gender thing. I think there's something about it's okay for girls to cry, but to get mad. I also think maybe just like people in my life who I saw their expressions or outbursts of anger as like dangerous and scary. And so I think that to me was like, well, I'm not going to be dangerous and scary, and I shouldn't be dangerous and scary because I think there's like a gender dynamic there as well.
Dangerous and scary, as in, oh my God, this person is violent and
out of control,
or is crazy.
No, not crazy. Just like out of control of their person. Essentially, there's something. If I see a person crying, I don't think, oh, that person can't control themselves. I think they're going through a hard time, and it like might open up feelings of compassion, empathy. Do I want to help the person? I can empathize with the person. If I see someone angry, I just think I got to get away from this person. This person could cause harm. It does not instigate any feelings of empathy or compassion in me. It's like fight or flight mode a little bit.
Yeah, it's like the degree when you encounter somebody who is a real rabid alcoholic that can really turn you off on alcohol.
Which I don't think is fair. Like from a logical perspective, it's not fair to say that someone isn't like just because someone's crying that they're still themselves versus someone is angry, they're not themselves. Like it doesn't make logical sense, but that's...
Especially if you don't buy into free will. Because you know that we're the product of our brain dragging us. I think it's Jonathan Haidt who had this metaphor of our rationality is a human riding an elephant.
A human riding an elephant? Yeah.
Yeah. The human may think that he's steering the elephant this way or that, but it's actually the elephant who's the emotional baggage that's in control.
I actually just read a paragraph that I highlighted. One second, I'm going to get it. I just read on the subway yesterday. I'm reading The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. That's not how you pronounce that. Anyway, but this paragraph kind of struck me. So he says, "For now, I want to emphasize that emotion is not opposed to reason. Our emotions assign value to experiences, and thus are the foundation of reason. Our self-experience is the product of the balance between our rational and our emotional brains. When these two systems are in balance, we, quote, feel like ourselves. However, when our survival is at stake, these systems can function relatively independently." I just like that because I think I do often think of emotionality and rationality as dueling functions. There's like, I think of them very like binarily. There's like a war, like an inner war between my logic and my feelings. And I don't know, I just like this paragraph because he was like, no, actually we don't. Emotions are the foundation of reason. When they're in balance is when we feel like ourselves. And I don't know, that kind of struck me. I liked thinking of them less as in potential conflict all the time.
I mean, if you take the Heights metaphor, because I think from my perspective, the whole rationality thing is a bit of a smokescreen. But to take the metaphor, I think it is true that we still have a perception of our rational choice making or of our volition.
As if it existed completely separate from what we're feeling. As if it existed
independently, and therefore whether or not it's it really has the power to steer us one way or another, we need to feel that it is aligned with our emotions. And I think because he's writing on the idea of trauma and cognitive dissonance, and part of it is when you have that conflict. When your perception of your rationality aligns with the way you experience your emotional state, that is the, I guess, sort of flow. It creates a lot of anxiety when you have this conflict that you feel that you need to reconcile between the two.
Yeah, and I feel like that's actually another thing that I have gained from our friendship. I feel like you've always understood that it doesn't matter how much your brain is ready to accept something and move on. Like if you're emotionally not ready, it's like you're emotionally not ready. Stop beating yourself up about it. Just let it happen. And that's also like an approach to life that I didn't have, and I think I've taken from you and knowing you that has been helpful for me when my brain tells me stop thinking and feeling this way. You're fine and ready to move on. You know?
I think it's also the accepting that it's just fine to not be okay to move on.
Yeah.
And while also sometimes you can move on while not moving on. Like that's another thing. That's just, I guess, the reality of living in the in a world where you sometimes need to, get out and make money and, and do things. So you technically have to in theory move on, but you're not there. That's where I would love for the Helen Russell revolution to actually take place, that we find a way to allow effective social interaction where people still come to work and still act socially without pretending that they are fully there.
I'm a little skeptical that we'd ever achieve that, but I could see a world in which art were more part of everyday life, and you would be able to access and experience and recognize those emotions in you that you're not allowed to necessarily trot out every day in the workplace. But if there were art that you experienced on your walk home and in the park and maybe even in the office, who knows? I wonder if that would be a way of kind of putting people a little bit more into balance. Because it just seems so marginalized in our society. Art is just like left to these little corners, and it does not feel like something that we can access on a daily basis in a way that would be cathartic and helpful.
I don't know. Helen brings that point up about having art more accessible. I worry that that could mean too many things. Does that mean any? I have a lot of problem with Germany's
their overgenerous funding of art
that leads to a lot of just random shit,
Getting money.
and I'm conflicted about this. I don't think I'm getting any profound catharsis from it, but on the other hand, there is something that just enlivens the city, that you can walk around and there's performance everywhere.
And calling back to our conversation with Ken Goshen, like I would place most of the blame on that in the art world itself. Actually, like I would actually charge. I don't know if there's I think there's departments of loneliness in cities now. So maybe I would charge future departments of happiness to be bold, to be brave, and bring cheesy fucking art. Like art that isn't going to be in a gallery and isn't going to like make millions of dollars, but art that people like. Art that like gets people
To feel something in the middle of the day. It has to be more than just something that they like, something that actually engages them in some enjoyable way. Unlike Marvel, which just leaves you dead inside, something that, you see around the city and makes
those
you...
pianos on the side of the road that people can play.
Things that pick
kind
your
of shit.
interest, as that activate your brain as you walk, and that doesn't let you completely zombie out.
Yeah.
Anything that is driving you out of the monotony of your routine, I think is definitely healthy.
I also think there's something where we place too much of a premium on observing art instead of creating it. Like there should be, I almost feel like you can zombify out on art and not actually engage with the emotions of it. I feel like there has to be like a second step. Like for sure, like Marvel, or even like really good television. Like you can binge a really good television series that has great themes and ideas and emotions. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to incorporate that into your own kind of emotional vocabulary. I feel like there kind of has to be more instigations of like what is a creative impulse that would result from your experience of that art. You know what I mean? There has to be like a second step that I feel like most people don't know how to access in themselves. I mean, myself included. Like where do you go from that?
Because it gets you numb at some point. Not to mention that the overabundance of cultural products mean that you don't need to spend time with one thing for too long. You don't need to have it stay with you because you can just move to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole other point, and we'll leave it to another conversation. But the value of boredom has been discussed before.
Mm-hmm.
The power to stop.
Stimulating yourself with content and letting yourself just be alone in your boredom. Think back about the thing that you saw 2 weeks ago and see if you can appreciate new aspects of it because you've got nothing else to do.
Has someone written a book on the death of boredom? I would totally read that.
Yeah, we should find that person and interview them.
I don't know. I almost wonder if it's like the invention of time and clocks. I wonder if that was the beginning of the end of the death of the beginning of the end of boredom.
That's funny when you start thinking about things in passing increments. But about the idea of ephemerality and mortality, I've always been there.
Yes, no, but I think I definitely remember reading like tracts from like the industrial age or industrial revolution age, and there was a huge backlash against like, oh my god, it's like there's busyness all the time. And I do feel like there was like a psychic shift where one went from leisurely pondering and being bored more. I mean, of
Suddenly
obviously
you
a certain
see the
class,
clock
but
chasing you. And
yeah, there's something there where, and I think it seems like it's only gotten worse over time, and not. I feel like I just can't. I don't know when the last time people so actively avoid being bored. It's like they can't stand to be alone with themselves for even a second, you know?
Yeah, I never thought about it in the context of clock. I thought about clocks in the way that it obviously systematized the world, and an obsession of mine is how the invention of clocks, I think it's in the late 17th or early 18th century, completely turned around the available metaphors for specifically European folk. Suddenly everything's a clock. That's how you start getting people like Descartes thinking of the body as a machine, because clockwork is readily available.
God wound up a clock and then let it go.
Right. It's deism and determinism.
Right.
Men as automatons.
I always did love thinking about the way that the material world circumscribes and redefines our social metaphors. But I never thought of it in the context of boredom, in the way that it sets our lives into increments of time. And suddenly you're able to count the ways in which your life is passing and just slipping through your fingers. Just need to make sure not to slip into over nostalgizing of the past, the way that some scholars, as we will discuss with Mark Lila, nowadays idealize the medieval period or Roman period, eras when dying from dysentery was, Wednesdays.
I also think it does connect to what we were talking about earlier about emotions. It's like there's no time to deal with emotions, right?
Yes.
It's like we are automatons. We are we are productive creatures. We have limited time. We must maximize productivity in every moment, and emotions are not that. They often get in the way of our productivity. Right. And I don't know. One thing we didn't talk about very much was I feel like there is a societal push now around like mental health, and everyone seems to be talking about it. Everyone seems to be acknowledging that like we need to think about and improve our mental health. But there seems to be there's some sort of weird dissonance happening for me where I feel like more people are trying to make it less of a taboo, but at the same time it's all in the framework of, because we got to fix ourselves, because we got to be better, right? There's like a acknowledge mental health, but we got to get better to, you know what I'm saying? And I'm not sure if I've put my finger yet on what it is that's bugging me about the mental health theme coming up more and more.
My instinct is first that it usually comes in the context of this question of productivity.
Mental health is the path for you to make sure that your problems don't interfere with your work. We need to bring you back to, emotional normalcy, basically.
Right. It's about how to be happy.
It's about how to be, exactly. It's about how to be happy, not how to be sad.
Right. Which I bet even with like Helen's book, I don't even know to what extent she uses the phrase like you need to learn to be sad to be happy. But even if she's not, the way you marketed it, that's what you do in America. Like, that's how you get people to accept sadness. It's because I'm on a journey to happiness.
The subtitle of her book is all I learned about getting happier by being sad better.
There you go. Like, there is no acceptance to, I guess we're bringing it back full circle now to just being defiantly sad for the sake of it, or accepting that as part of who you are potentially.
That actually would have been a nice thing to ask her about.
Yeah. Because I think then the question becomes, can it be healthy or healthier to just be sad? Like, or maybe it's
sad
not
for its own sake.
Sad for its own sake. But then I wonder, maybe it's not even healthy. Maybe it's just like a little bit of an echo of the Mark Lila conversation that we're going to have, where can being sad still result in a good life, right? Like, how are you measuring what a life is worth? And does happiness need to be a metric on one's the value of one's life or how good it was or whatever, you know?
It's funny, we've moved from the question of should happiness be the metric for everything, including justice and social growth, to should happiness be even considered at all in anything?
Right.
Well, that is the fullest circle you can go.
Yeah.
So
Very uncertain.
yeah. Well, if you stayed with us for this long, bless
Cheers
your
to
heart,
you.
and we'll see you next time.